Have you ever stopped to wonder who is actually making the decisions in your life? Not the obvious ones, not what to eat today or which movie to watch tonight. I'm talking about the decisions that quietly shape the course of your entire existence. Why do you keep falling for the same kind of people? Why do certain opportunities seem to appear effortlessly in other people's lives while yours always feel just out of reach? Why do some fears refuse to disappear even after years of trying to overcome them? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, how many of your thoughts are truly yours? Carl Jung believed that most people would go through life convinced they were acting freely while being guided by forces they had never consciously met. Invisible patterns, forgotten memories, ancient emotional wounds, hidden parts of the personality silently influencing every decision, every relationship, every ambition, and every failure. According to Jung, the greatest illusion of the human mind is not believing in something false. It is believing that we know ourselves, because the mind you recognize, the voice you call me, the personality you defend every single day, may represent only a very small island floating on an ocean you have never explored. Beneath that island exists another intelligence. It remembers everything you tried to forget. It stores every fear you buried, every humiliation, every desire you denied, every version of yourself that society forced you to abandon. And although you may never hear it speak directly, it never stops speaking through your choices, through your emotions, through your dreams, through the people you cannot forget, through the situations that seem to repeat themselves no matter how hard you try to escape them. Most people spend their entire lives trying to change the visible parts of themselves. They change jobs, cities, relationships, habits, even their appearance. But nothing truly changes because the invisible program remains exactly the same. Jung once wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Few sentences have carried such unsettling truth, because if he was right, then destiny may not be something waiting for you in the future. It may simply be yesterday repeating itself in different clothes. Imagine discovering that the life you call your personality was written long before you were old enough to choose it. Imagine realizing that many of your fears were inherited, that many of your beliefs were borrowed, that many of your ambitions never belonged to you in the first place. If that possibility feels uncomfortable, good. Because transformation rarely begins with comfort. It begins the moment certainty starts to crack. And today, we are going to descend into the hidden architecture of the human mind, not to find monsters, but to discover the invisible program that has been quietly writing your story since the beginning. Because once you see it, it can no longer control you. And that was the beginning of what Carl Jung called individuation, not becoming someone new, but finally meeting the person you have always been beneath every mask. The illusion of conscious choice. There is an unsettling experiment that has fascinated psychologists for decades. Researchers discovered that the human brain often begins preparing a decision several moments before the conscious mind becomes aware that a choice has been made. Think about what that means. Your conscious mind, the part of you that says, "I decided this," may actually be arriving after the decision has already begun. Carl Jung would not have been surprised by this. Long before modern neuroscience existed, he proposed something that many of his contemporaries considered impossible. He believed that consciousness was not the ruler of the human psyche. It was merely its smallest visible part, like the tip of an iceberg drifting across an endless ocean. Everything people proudly called their personality, everything they believed defined who they were, was supported by an invisible psychological structure extending far beneath awareness. Jung spent decades observing something extraordinary. Patients often arrived convinced that their problems were unique. One woman repeatedly fell in love with emotionally unavailable men. Another abandoned every opportunity just before success arrived. A businessman destroyed every prosperous partnership he built. A gifted artist never finished a single masterpiece. At first glance, each story seemed different. Different ages, different families, different countries, different professions. But beneath the surface, Jung kept finding the same invisible architecture, the same emotional mechanisms, the same unconscious patterns repeating themselves through completely different lives. It was as if each person carried an internal script they had never consciously written, a script quietly directing relationships, money, fear, confidence, failure. Even the people they believed they had randomly met. The tragedy was not that these patterns existed. The tragedy was that almost nobody knew they were living inside them. Imagine spending your entire life inside a house without ever realizing there were walls around you. You would call those walls reality. You would defend them. You would build your identity around them. And anyone suggesting another possibility would seem completely irrational. According to Jung, this is precisely how the unconscious operates. It never announces itself. It never says, "I am controlling your decisions." Instead, it whispers softly, patiently, almost invisibly. It speaks through emotions that appear without warning, through irrational attractions, through unexplained resentment, through recurring dreams, through fears that seem older than memory itself. And because these experiences feel deeply personal, we mistake them for our authentic selves. But are they? Or are they simply programs that began long before we learned how to question them? Think about your earliest memories, not necessarily the memories you consciously remember, but the emotional atmosphere surrounding your childhood, the expressions on your parents' faces, the arguments, the silence, the expectations, the praise you received, the criticism you couldn't escape, the moments you felt accepted, and the moments you secretly concluded, "I am not enough." Children rarely analyze these experiences. They absorb them. Their minds do not yet possess the ability to separate observation from identity. If a child repeatedly feels invisible, the unconscious may quietly conclude, "I must become someone who earns love." If a child constantly experiences criticism, another invisible conclusion may emerge. No matter what I do, it will never be enough. Years pass, the child becomes an adult, the memories fade, but the conclusions remain, not as thoughts, as identity. This is why people often cannot explain their own behavior. Ask someone why they sabotage every healthy relationship. They may sincerely answer, "I don't know." Ask another why they are terrified of success. Again, "I don't know." Ask why someone constantly seeks approval from people who never appreciate them. The answer remains the same. "I don't know." The conscious mind does not know, but the unconscious always does. It remembers every emotional conclusion ever accepted as truth, not because it wants to punish you, but because its primary purpose is survival. And survival has very little interest in happiness. This is one of Jung's most misunderstood insights. The unconscious does not ask, "Will this make you fulfilled?" It asks, "Has this kept you alive before?" If the answer is yes, it repeats the pattern again and again and again, even if that pattern slowly destroys your life. This explains something that confuses millions of people. Why intelligent individuals continue making decisions they themselves recognize as harmful. Why brilliant minds remain trapped inside toxic relationships. Why capable professionals continuously underestimate themselves. Why some people become terrified the moment life begins to improve. From the outside, these behaviors seem irrational. From the perspective of the unconscious, they make perfect sense. Because what looks like self-sabotage may actually be psychological protection against becoming someone the unconscious has never learned to recognize as safe. And here lies one of the greatest paradoxes Carl Jung ever uncovered. The mind would rather remain familiar than become free. Even suffering can become familiar, even loneliness can become predictable, even failure can become psychologically comfortable, not because anyone enjoys pain, but because certainty often feels safer than transformation, which raises a disturbing possibility. Perhaps the greatest obstacle in your life has never been your circumstances. Perhaps it has been the invisible program quietly convincing you that your current identity is the only one capable of keeping you alive. And if that is true, then the journey ahead is not about becoming someone else. It is about discovering who has been making your decisions all along, because only then Can you begin writing a different story? The first program you never chose before you ever learned your own name, before you developed opinions, before you knew the meaning of success, failure, love, or fear. Your mind was already collecting information, not logical information, emotional information. A newborn child doesn't interpret the world through language. It interprets everything through sensation, safety, warmth, absence, presence, acceptance, rejection. Every interaction becomes another invisible instruction about how reality works. Carl Jung believed that the earliest layers of the psyche are formed long before the ego becomes fully developed. This is why the unconscious often feels older than memory itself. It remembers experiences that the conscious mind can no longer describe. Have you ever felt an immediate sense of distrust towards someone you had just met? No evidence, no explanation, just a feeling. Or perhaps you've walked into a place you've never visited before and felt strangely at home, almost as if something inside you recognized it. Modern psychology often calls these intuitions. Jung looked much deeper. He believed the unconscious was constantly comparing present experiences with emotional patterns accumulated across an entire lifetime. But those patterns were not always objective. Sometimes they were built from misunderstandings created by a child's limited perception. Imagine a little boy whose father rarely expressed affection. Perhaps the father worked long hours. Perhaps he loved his son deeply but didn't know how to communicate it. The child cannot understand adult responsibilities. He cannot see financial pressure. He cannot understand emotional repression. Instead, his unconscious reaches the simplest possible conclusion: I must not be worthy of love. Years later, that boy becomes a successful man. People admire him. Friends respect him. His family loves him. Yet every compliment feels temporary, every relationship feels fragile, every achievement feels incomplete. Not because reality confirms his fears, but because the unconscious continues protecting an identity created decades earlier. That identity quietly whispers, if they truly knew you, they would leave. And because the unconscious desperately seeks consistency, it begins creating situations that confirm its own belief. Without realizing it, he becomes emotionally distant. He struggles to trust. He withdraws before others can reject him. Eventually, relationships end. His unconscious quietly says, "See, I was right all along." This is one of the most painful mechanisms Jung ever described. The unconscious does not merely remember your beliefs. It actively searches for evidence to preserve them, not because it hates you, because consistency creates psychological stability. The psyche prefers a painful certainty over an unfamiliar freedom. This explains why genuine transformation often feels terrifying. People imagine fear appears because something dangerous is happening. But many times, fear appears because something unfamiliar is happening, and the unconscious interprets unfamiliarity as risk. Imagine someone who has spent 20 years believing they are incapable. Now imagine that same person suddenly receives an extraordinary opportunity, a promotion, a successful business, a healthy relationship. From the outside, everything seems perfect, yet inside, an invisible conflict begins. One part of the personality says, "This is exactly what I always wanted." Another part whispers, "This is not who we are." Few people realize that these internal voices are often competing identities. One belongs to conscious intention, the other belongs to unconscious programming, and unless those two parts become integrated, the unconscious usually wins, not through force, through repetition. Every repeated thought strengthens the existing program. Every repeated emotion deepens it. Every repeated reaction convinces the psyche, "This is who I am." Jung noticed something remarkable in his patients. Whenever someone experienced a major breakthrough, a hidden resistance almost always appeared immediately afterward. A man finally forgives himself, then suddenly feels overwhelming guilt. A woman finally discovers genuine confidence, then begins questioning every decision she makes. Someone escapes years of anxiety, only to create a new reason to worry. Why? Because the unconscious isn't trying to destroy progress. It is trying to preserve identity, and identity, once established, becomes incredibly difficult to change. This is why motivation alone rarely transforms a life. You can read hundreds of books, listen to thousands of motivational speeches, repeat affirmations every morning, but if the unconscious still believes you are the frightened child who first interpreted the world through fear, every conscious effort eventually collides with an invisible psychological wall. That collision exhausts people. They begin believing they lack discipline, willpower, talent, character. But Jung proposed a radically different explanation. The problem is rarely effort. The problem is internal contradiction. One part of the psyche wants expansion. Another part believes expansion is dangerous. One part dreams of love. Another still fears abandonment. One part desires abundance. Another remains loyal to an identity built around scarcity. This hidden conflict quietly drains enormous amounts of psychological energy. And because most people never become aware of it, and they spend years fighting themselves without understanding who the real opponent is. Perhaps that is why Jung insisted that self-knowledge is not a luxury, it is survival, because every unconscious pattern eventually demands expression. Ignored fear becomes anxiety, ignored grief becomes numbness, ignored anger becomes projection, ignored potential becomes regret. Nothing disappears inside the psyche, it simply changes its form, which means that somewhere inside every human being, there are forgotten parts still waiting to be seen, not because they seek attention, but because they seek completion. And the longer they remain hidden, the more quietly they continue writing the story you believe is your own. The shadow is writing your story. If there is one idea that made Carl Jung famous around the world, it was not the collective unconscious. It was not archetypes. It was not dreams. It was something far more personal. Something every human being carries, whether they admit it or not. The shadow. Few psychological concepts have been misunderstood as much as this one. Most people hear the word shadow and immediately imagine evil, darkness, violence, cruelty, but Jung meant something entirely different. The shadow is not the worst part of you. The shadow is every part of you that your conscious personality refused to accept. Read that sentence again, because hidden inside it is one of the greatest psychological discoveries ever made. Every child learns very early in life that certain behaviors receive love, and others receive rejection. Some families reward obedience, others reward achievement. Some admire emotional strength, others punish vulnerability. Without realizing it, the child begins making unconscious decisions. If I want to be loved, I must never cry. I must never fail. I must always be useful. I must always be strong. Little by little, the personality begins editing itself. Certain qualities are allowed into consciousness. Others are quietly pushed into darkness, not because they disappeared, because they became unacceptable. This process creates what Jung called the persona, the social self, the version of you that learned how to survive the expectations of the world. The persona smiles, it performs, it adapts, it knows exactly what others expect to see, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. Without the persona, human society could barely function. The problem begins when you mistake the mask for the person wearing it, because every quality excluded from the persona must go somewhere. It doesn't vanish, it descends into the shadow. Imagine a magnificent theater on the stage. Your persona performs every single day, confident, polite, successful, calm, reasonable, but beneath the stage, hidden behind heavy curtains, another audience is waiting. Every fear you denied, every desire you suppressed, every emotion you judged unacceptable, every talent you abandoned because someone once laughed at it. None of them disappeared. They simply stopped speaking in your conscious voice. Instead, they began communicating through symbols, through emotional reactions, through dreams, through attraction, through projection. And projection may be one of the most powerful psychological forces operating in your life right now. Imagine meeting someone for the first time. Within minutes, you intensely dislike them. They haven't insulted you, they haven't harmed you, yet something about them irritates you beyond explanation. Why? Jung would ask a question that almost nobody else would think to ask. What part of yourself are you seeing in that person? because the psyche has an extraordinary defense mechanism. Rather than recognizing rejected qualities within ourselves, we unconsciously perceive them in others, the arrogance we cannot admit, the insecurity we refuse to face, the envy, the dependence, the need for approval, the desire for control. Instead of recognizing these tendencies inside, the unconscious projects them outward. Suddenly, the problem always seems to belong to someone else. This explains why certain people trigger emotions that appear completely disproportionate. Sometimes, they are not touching your present. They are touching an unconscious wound that has been waiting for years. Jung once remarked that everything which irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. At first glance, that idea feels uncomfortable. But think about it honestly. Why do some criticisms stay in your mind for years, while others disappear within minutes? Why does one person's rejection become unforgettable, while another person's opinion means almost nothing? Because the event itself is rarely the real issue. The event activates something that already existed, a hidden emotional structure, a forgotten identity, an invisible conclusion formed long ago. This is why healing cannot begin by changing everyone around you. Sooner or later, life introduces different people who awaken the same unconscious pattern, different faces, same emotional experience, different relationships, same ending, different jobs, same frustration, different cities, same loneliness. People often call this bad luck. Jung called it unconscious repetition. Until the hidden pattern becomes conscious, life continues presenting new opportunities to see it, not as punishment, as invitation. An invitation that most people unknowingly refuse, because facing the shadow requires something extraordinarily difficult. Humility. Not the humility of thinking less of yourself, the humility of admitting, I may not know myself as well as I believe. That sentence marks the beginning of every authentic psychological transformation. Because the greatest prison is not ignorance, it is certainty. The certainty that you already know who you are. The certainty that your reactions are always justified. The certainty that your version of reality is complete. Jung discovered that genuine growth almost always begins the moment those certainties begin to collapse. Only then does the unconscious find enough space to finally speak, and what it says can change everything. The moment your life becomes fate. There is a sentence Carl Jung wrote that is echoed through psychology for nearly a century. It is only 14 words long, yet it has the power to completely change the way you understand your own life. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Most people read that sentence, nod in agreement, and move on. But very few stop to ask the question that truly matters. What does it actually mean for the unconscious to direct your life? Because if Jung was right, then fate is not some mysterious force waiting in the future. It is something happening every single day, quietly, patiently, without asking your permission. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning. You drink your coffee, answer a few messages, drive the same roads, speak with the same people, think the same thoughts, feel the same emotional reactions. Nothing seems unusual. Yet beneath every one of those ordinary moments, thousands of unconscious decisions are unfolding. You look at one opportunity and ignore another. You trust one stranger and avoid someone else. You say yes, you say no, you hesitate, you postpone, you remain silent, you apologize when no apology was necessary, you accept treatment that secretly hurts you, you reject possibilities that could change your life forever, and because every decision feels natural, you never stop to ask, who made that choice? This is how unconscious programming survives, not through dramatic events, but through ordinary repetition. One ordinary day, repeated thousands of times. People often imagine that transformation happens during extraordinary moments. A profound conversation, a spiritual awakening, a life-changing book, a crisis. Sometimes it does, but much more often, life changes through tiny decisions that nobody notices. Because identity itself is nothing more than accumulated repetition. Every morning your brain asks the same invisible question, who am I today? And every habit, every emotional reaction, every belief answers that question again and again and again. Eventually, the answer becomes so familiar, you stop questioning it. You simply call it my personality. But Jung challenged that assumption. He believed personality was not fixed. It was alive, changing, expanding, or shrinking, depending on whether consciousness continued growing. Imagine a river. Most people believe the river creates its own path. But that is only partially true. The river follows the landscape beneath it. Invisible valleys, hidden rocks, ancient geological formations created thousands of years earlier. Your conscious life resembles that river. The thoughts you notice, the emotions you feel, the choices you make, flow across an invisible psychological landscape built long before today's circumstances ever arrived. That landscape is your unconscious, and unless its structure changes, the river continues flowing in exactly the same direction. This explains one of the strangest experiences human beings have. Have you ever promised yourself, this time will be different? This relationship, this job, this year, this version of yourself. For a while, everything feels new. You become motivated, disciplined, optimistic. Then, weeks later, something strangely familiar begins happening. The old habits quietly return, the same fears, the same excuses, the same emotional reactions, the same patterns. People often interpret this as failure. Jung saw something entirely different. He saw evidence that consciousness had tried to move forward, while the unconscious remained exactly where it had always been. Imagine trying to steer a massive ship using only your hands. The wheel responds slightly. For a few moments, the ship changes direction, but beneath the surface, thousands of tons continue moving according to their previous momentum. Eventually, the ship slowly returns to its original course, not because steering was impossible, because changing direction required transforming the force beneath the surface. The unconscious behaves in remarkably similar ways. Willpower can alter behavior for a short time. Awareness transforms behavior permanently. That distinction changes everything. Because most people spend years trying to control themselves when what they actually need is to understand themselves. Control demands constant effort. Understanding creates freedom. Think about someone struggling with chronic anxiety. Their first instinct is usually to eliminate anxious thoughts, to suppress them, ignore them, fight them. But Jung repeatedly observed something unexpected. Whatever consciousness refuses to acknowledge, the unconscious amplifies. The rejected emotion does not disappear, it simply finds another language. Sometimes it becomes physical tension, sometimes exhaustion, sometimes nightmares. Sometimes endless overthinking. Sometimes a relationship that mysteriously recreates the same emotional wound. The psyche always seeks balance, and balance cannot exist where half of the personality has been abandoned. That is why Jung never described healing as becoming perfect. He described it as becoming whole. There is a profound difference. Perfection removes, wholeness integrates. Perfection hides weakness, wholeness understands it. Perfection creates masks, wholeness removes them. Perhaps this is why so many successful people secretly feel empty. From the outside, everything appears complete. Money, recognition, status, admiration. Yet something continues whispering, this is not enough. Because the unconscious cannot be deceived by appearances. It is not interested in the image you project. It is interested in the truth you avoid. And the longer that truth remains hidden, the louder life becomes, sometimes through conflict, sometimes through loneliness, sometimes through failure, not because life wishes to punish you, but because the psyche is always trying to restore its forgotten balance. Every crisis, every emotional collapse, every unexpected ending may contain a question the unconscious has been asking for years, a question so quiet you never realized it was there until now. Why your mind keeps recreating the same life? There is a question that almost everyone asks at some point. Why does the same kind of pain keep returning? Not exactly the same situation. The faces change, the places change, the years pass, yet somehow the emotional experience feels strangely familiar. Different relationship, same disappointment, different job, same frustration, different dream, same feeling of never being enough. People usually blame coincidence, bad luck, other people, their childhood, their circumstances. Sometimes all of these factors play a role, But Carl Jung believed there was another force operating beneath everything else. He called it the autonomy of the unconscious. That phrase may sound complicated, its meaning is not. It simply means that part of your mind behaves as if it had a life of its own. Think about that for a moment. What if your unconscious is not merely storing memories? What if it is actively trying to complete something that has never been resolved? Imagine reading the same unfinished novel over and over again. Each time you stop before the final chapter, no matter how many years pass, your mind never experiences closure. Eventually, you begin again. Not because you enjoy repetition, because the story remains unfinished. Jung believes something very similar happens inside the human psyche. Every emotional wound that remains unconscious continues searching for resolution, not through thinking, through experience. This is why life often appears to repeat itself. Not because reality is against you, but because your psyche keeps presenting the same lesson through different circumstances. The unconscious is remarkably patient. It does not become frustrated, it simply changes the scenery. If one relationship fails to teach you what you need to see, another relationship appears. If one professional disappointment leaves the pattern untouched, another arrives. If one betrayal fails to awaken consciousness, life quietly prepares another. To the conscious mind, this feels cruel. To the unconscious, it feels necessary. Because what has not been understood cannot yet be completed. Jung observed this pattern so frequently that he began to notice something extraordinary. People often believed they were choosing their lives, when in reality, their unresolved inner world was choosing for them. A woman abandoned by an emotionally distant father repeatedly found herself attracted to emotionally unavailable partners, not consciously. She desperately wanted someone who would stay. But another force operated beneath awareness. The familiar emotional landscape of longing had become psychologically recognizable. The unconscious mistook familiarity for love. A man who grew up believing that his worth depended entirely on achievement became incapable of resting. Even after extraordinary success, peace never arrived because success had never been the true goal. The unconscious was still trying to earn a love that should never have required earning. Do you see the pattern? The present was never acting alone. The past continued speaking through it, not as memory, as identity. This is why Jung insisted that consciousness is not simply becoming aware of your thoughts. It is becoming aware of the invisible emotional logic beneath them. Because every recurring pattern follows a hidden logic. Fear follows logic. Perfectionism follows logic. People-pleasing follows logic. Self-sabotage follows logic. The logic may no longer serve your life, but at some point, it protected you. Imagine a child growing up in a home where expressing emotion always led to ridicule. Eventually, silence becomes safety. Years later, that same child becomes an adult incapable of emotional intimacy. Friends describe them as cold. Partners describe them as distant. The person themselves wonders, why can't I connect? The answer is not found in adulthood. It is buried inside an old survival strategy that never realized the danger had passed. This is one of Jung's most compassionate insights. The unconscious is not your enemy. It is your oldest protector. The tragedy is that it protects today's life using yesterday's map, and yesterday's map rarely leads to tomorrow. Perhaps this explains why real transformation feels less like learning and more like remembering. Remembering the parts of yourself that existed before fear decided who you had to become. Remembering the confidence that existed before rejection. The curiosity that existed before criticism. The spontaneity that existed before shame. Every human being enters the world carrying extraordinary psychological potential. Not perfection, potential, yet little by little, life teaches us which parts are acceptable and which parts must disappear. The unconscious faithfully stores every abandoned fragment, waiting patiently, sometimes for decades. Then something unexpected happens. A conversation, a dream, a crisis, a book, a single sentence. Suddenly, one forgotten part begins moving again. Many people describe these moments as spiritual awakenings. Jung described them differently. He believed the psyche was attempting to restore its own balance, not by adding something new, but by recovering something ancient, something that had always belonged to you. This is why profound transformation often feels strangely familiar, not because you have become someone different, because for the first time in years, you have stopped pretending to be someone else. And yet, there is still one mystery we have not answered. If the unconscious keeps repeating patterns, how does it communicate them? How does something invisible make itself known? Jung believed the answer appears every single night, while your conscious mind is asleep, because there is one language the unconscious has spoken since the beginning of humanity, a language older than words, older than civilization itself, the language of symbols. And once you learn to recognize those symbols, you begin seeing messages that were always there, hidden in plain sight. The secret language of the unconscious. Imagine living your entire life beside someone extraordinarily intelligent, someone who never sleeps, who remembers every experience you have ever lived, who understands every fear you have never confessed, who knows every version of yourself that you abandoned in order to be accepted. Now imagine that this presence has been trying to communicate with you every single day, not through words, not through logic, but through symbols. According to Carl Jung, that presence exists, and it is the unconscious. One of the greatest mistakes modern society has made is believing that the unconscious communicates the same way consciousness does. It doesn't. Consciousness speaks through language. The unconscious speaks through images. This is why dreams often feel so strange. A dream rarely tells you exactly what it means. Instead, it presents a story, a landscape, a child, a snake, a house, a storm, a staircase, a forgotten room. To the conscious mind, these images appear random. To Jung, nothing could be further from the truth. He believed the unconscious was constantly translating psychological realities into symbolic experiences, because symbols can express what ordinary language cannot. Think about your own life. Have you ever dreamed of arriving late to an important place, of losing your way, of searching endlessly for someone you could never find? Perhaps you dismissed those dreams the moment you woke up. Most people do. But Jung spent decades listening carefully to these invisible stories. Again and again, he noticed something astonishing. The dreams were often describing psychological situations long before consciousness recognized them. A person dreaming repeatedly of collapsing buildings soon entered an identity crisis. Someone dreaming about locked doors later admitted they had spent years emotionally closed to everyone around them. Another dreamed night after night of wandering through unfamiliar forests. Months later, they left a career that had never truly belonged to them. Coincidence? Jung did not think so. He believed dreams were compensatory, not in the sense of correcting behavior, but in the sense of restoring psychological balance. When consciousness becomes too narrow, the unconscious widens the picture. When the ego becomes arrogant, dreams introduce humility. When fear dominates waking life, dreams quietly remind us of forgotten courage. When we ignore our emotional wounds, dreams return carrying symbols we can no longer avoid. The unconscious is remarkably creative. It does not accuse, it reveals. Imagine trying to explain the ocean using only numbers. Impossible. Some realities are simply too vast for literal language. The psyche understands this, so instead of facts, it offers symbols. A bridge may represent transition, a mountain, a challenge that demands inner growth, a child, the beginning of something still fragile within you, a forgotten house, the unexplored architecture of your own mind. Jung often asked his patients an unusual question, not what happened in your dream, but what did the dream make you feel? Because emotions are the key that unlocks the symbol. The same image can carry entirely different meanings depending on the emotional experience surrounding it. A dark forest may terrify one person, For another, it may feel peaceful. The unconscious never creates generic messages. It speaks the language of your own psychological history, and yet, some symbols seem to appear everywhere, across continents, across religions, across civilizations, separated by thousands of years. The serpent, the wise old man, the great mother, the hero, the shadow, the child, the journey, the circle, the tree. People who never met, who never shared a language, who lived on opposite sides of the planet, dreamed remarkably similar images. How was that possible? This question fascinated Jung for decades. Eventually, it led him toward one of the most revolutionary ideas in modern psychology, the collective unconscious. He proposed that beneath your personal unconscious exists a deeper psychological layer shared by all humanity, a vast reservoir of symbolic patterns inherited across generations, not inherited as memories, but as possibilities, as blueprints, as universal psychological structures waiting to awaken whenever life demands them. This is why myths from ancient Greece, sacred stories from India, biblical narratives, indigenous legends, and modern films often tell remarkably similar stories. The names change, the cultures change, but the psychological journey remains the same. The hero leaves home, faces darkness, meets unexpected allies, confronts a terrifying enemy, discovers hidden strength, returns transformed. Why? Because this story is not merely literature. It is the structure of psychological transformation itself. Every human being eventually receives an invitation to leave the familiar world of the ego, to descend into uncertainty, to confront the shadow, to discover forgotten aspects of the self, and finally, to return carrying a more complete identity. The greatest myths were never simply entertaining stories, they were maps of the human soul. Perhaps that is why certain books, certain films, certain pieces of music move us so deeply. Something inside recognizes them, not because we consciously understand them, because an ancient part of the psyche whispers, "I know this journey." But here lies the mystery. If the unconscious has been speaking through symbols your entire life, why do so few people ever hear its voice? The answer is surprisingly simple. Because modern life is designed to keep consciousness constantly occupied. Notifications, deadlines, conversations, screens, noise, information, endless distraction. The unconscious does not compete with noise. It waits for silence, and silence has become one of the rarest experiences in the modern world. Perhaps this explains why so many people become uncomfortable the moment everything grows quiet, because in silence, the unconscious finally has room to speak, and what it has been trying to say may be the very thing capable of changing your life forever. The life that begins when you wake up. There is a moment that almost every person experiences. For some, it arrives after losing someone they deeply loved. For others, after a betrayal, a failure, a burnout, an unexpected silence, or perhaps after achieving everything they once believed would finally make them happy, only to discover that the emptiness remained. From the outside, these moments look like endings, but Carl Jung saw them differently. He believed they were invitations, not invitations to become someone else, but invitations to stop living as someone you were never meant to be. Because eventually, every mask becomes too heavy. Every performance becomes exhausting. Every identity built only to satisfy the expectations of others begins to crack. And when it does, most people panic. They believe something is wrong. They believe they are fallen apart, but perhaps they are finally falling into themselves. Think about a seed buried beneath the ground. If that seed could think, the first crack in its shell would probably feel like destruction. Everything familiar disappears, everything secure begins to dissolve, its old identity cannot survive. Yet without that rupture, nothing new could ever emerge. Human transformation follows the same law. The ego interprets change as loss. The self experiences it as birth. This is why the deepest psychological transformations rarely feel comfortable. They feel confusing, lonely, uncertain. Because the person you have been must slowly release its grip before the person you're becoming can finally breathe. Jung called this process individuation, not self-improvement, not perfection, not becoming superior to anyone else. Individuation is the lifelong journey of becoming psychologically whole. It is the courage to stop asking, "Who do people expect me to be?" and begin asking, "Who am I beneath every expectation?" That question changes everything, because the answer cannot be borrowed, it cannot be copied, it cannot be inherited. It must be discovered slowly, patiently, through observation, through honesty, through silence, through the willingness to face uncomfortable truths without immediately trying to escape them. Perhaps this is why Jung insisted that the greatest adventure a human being can undertake is not traveling across the world, it is traveling inward, because within that inner landscape, you eventually meet every forgotten part of yourself: the frightened child, the wounded teenager, the ambitious dreamer, the hidden creator, the silent observer, the shadow, the persona, and finally, the self, not as an idea, but as a living experience. Many people spend their entire lives searching for freedom in external circumstances: a different city, a different relationship, a different career, a different version of success. Yet wherever they go, the same invisible program quietly follows them, because geography cannot change unconscious identity, only awareness can. The moment you begin observing your reactions instead of immediately obeying them, the program weakens. The moment you question an old belief instead of automatically accepting it, the program weakens. The moment you stop projecting your forgotten fears onto everyone around you, the program weakens. Little by little, the unconscious stops directing your life from the shadows. Not because it disappears, but because it is finally welcomed into consciousness. This is the paradox that so many people misunderstand. The goal is not to destroy the unconscious, it is to establish a relationship with it, to listen instead of suppressing, to understand instead of fearing, to integrate instead of rejecting, because every part of you that is rejected eventually seeks expression, but every part of you that is understood becomes wisdom. Perhaps that is what true maturity really is, not knowing all the answers, but becoming capable of sitting with your own questions, without running away, without pretending, without hiding behind certainty. As this journey continues, you begin noticing subtle changes, you react less impulsively, you listen more carefully, you become less interested in proving yourself and more interested in understanding yourself. Approval loses its power, comparison begins to fade, silence no longer feels empty, it feels alive. And one day, without realizing exactly when it happened, you look back at the life you once believed was your destiny, the fears that controlled you, the patterns that repeated endlessly, the identity you defended so fiercely, and you recognize something extraordinary. You were never trapped by fate. You were living inside a story your unconscious had been telling for years. The moment you became conscious of that story, you picked up the pen, and for the first time, you began writing a different ending. Perhaps this is the greatest lesson Carl Jung left us. The purpose of life is not to become perfect. It is not to become admired. It is not even to become successful. The purpose of life is to become whole. Because the greatest prison has never been the world outside. It has always been the invisible world within. And the greatest freedom does not begin when life changes. It begins the moment you finally see who has been living it. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. But today, you know there is another possibility, and perhaps that possibility is where your real life finally begins.